Good evening and welcome to the IRDR monthly seminar. I'm delighted to have with us Sarita Robinson from the University of Central Lancashire, who's going to be talking about understanding human behaviour during a disaster. So Sarita is Deputy Head of School of the Psychology and Computer Science Department. She has 20 years of research experience looking at how people respond to life-threatening situations using a cognitive, neuropsychological and psychobiological approach. After completing her master's at the University of Manchester, Sarita went on to complete her PhD in cognitive changes in human survival. And then since the completion of her PhD, she's been based at the University of Central Lancashire and has continued her research in the survival field, working with both UK-based and international collaborators and clients. Anyway, without much further ado, I will hand over to Sarita. I'll just say she'll be speaking for about half the time to begin with, and there'll be a pause and there'll be an opportunity for you to questions at that point, and then we'll continue, and then there'll be another time at the end to have further questions. For questions, and because this is a webinar, please type them into the Q&A. Do start putting them into the Q&A right from the beginning, and I will then read those out and pose them to Sarita during the two stages. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, and over to Sarita. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Peter, for such a lovely introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. I'm just going to start to share my slides now, so there'll be a moment when you'll probably see the sort of mechanisms behind everything, but hopefully once we get going it should run smoothly. And we'll just flip back to is that displaying okay for everyone? I hope everyone can see that. So yes, just to
that's fine, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. So just to say, I'm going to be talking about understanding human behaviour during a disaster, and just to start with a little bit about myself. As Peter said, I've been a survival psychologist working in this field for the last 20 years since I did my PhD at Lancaster. I am a psychobiologist, so I'm interested in that brain and behaviour together, marrying the physiological changes with the psychological changes. I've worked with both civilian population, so working with the emergency services, mainly with the fire service, but also with the police. I do work down at RAF St Morgan, working with the SEER school down there, so I have some contacts down with the military, and as Peter said, I recently took the job as deputy head of school for our department, which means a little less time for research and a little bit more yeah, definitely more meetings at the moment. So what am I going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to go over some of the research in a sort of summary form from my work over the last 20 years. I'm going to do this in sort of the order of an emergency or a disaster. So I'm going to start off with looking at preparedness behaviours and what people do before a disaster strikes. And I'm going to move on to that acute section, you know, when a disaster is unfolding, what happens at that point, and how psychology can inform practice and our understanding of behaviour. And then I'm going to look at post-trauma. So what happens in that recovery phase, and for that, I'm going to look at things that I've been doing in the world of post-traumatic growth. So this is a little bit different from looking at the sort of negative outcomes from exposure to emergencies. I'm going to be looking at some of the positive outcomes that can happen. I suppose really, if you wanted to summarise all my research into just one question, it's how do we stop people dying during a disaster? That's really what I'm interested in. Why is it that when your brain needs you the most, when things have gone wrong, why is it at that point it decides to let you down in some situations? And what is it that we can actually do to help people to survive those really traumatic experiences. Now, when I was starting out, I was a big fan of the Sas Survival guide. I don't know whether some of you might have got that as a child for a Christmas present if you're about the same age as me. And basically, Lofty Wiseman wrote the manual of survival in its practical form. So how to do arm-to-arm combat, how to snare a rabbit, how to build a shelter, how to light a fire, all those really practical skills of survival. Now, a few years ago, probably going back about 10 years ago, I was at the Bushcraft show giving a talk, and Lofty was on just before me, and he said, you know, the thing is that survival is really only 15% the practical skills, and actually it's your mindset, it's the psychology, which is the other 85%. And obviously this meant that I warmed very much to Lofty, and we have become very good friends since. But he, as somebody who is a real expert in the field of survival, recognised the importance of the psychology, the mindset, when you're facing these really traumatic events. And moving all the way through to the current day, we know that COVID-19 is here. We're 11 months into this awful pandemic. And really, what COVID-19 has highlighted is how important that psychological research is to help us understand the behaviours that we're seeing. And some of the behaviours that we're seeing are quite problematic and disturbing. So things like non-compliance with lockdown measures, not following guidelines, or potentially not wanting to take the vaccine when offered. And so I think this has brought into sharp focus how psychology can really play an important part in disaster management, survival and recovery. Because with the best will in the world, we can have the best vaccine in the world. But if people won't take it, if there are some barriers to people accepting that vaccine, then we're not going to get out of this pandemic. So I said I'd start off by looking at preparedness. And I suppose, like anything, we need a framework that we can fit the sort of research that I do around. And time again, I go back to the Leach psychodynamic model, because it just helps me to think about the stages of an emergency. And that means I can compare the pre-impact, or that preparedness stage, in various emergencies. So that could be a human-made emergency, like a car crash, or a ship sinking, or a plane crashing, or a natural disaster, so an earthquake, hurricane, volcano, all those things, but before they happen. So they all have a pre-impact stage. Then we move through to the impact stage. So this is when the disaster hits, and we start to worry that things are going wrong. We see the smoke under the door, or we hear the pilot shouting, brace, brace, brace for impact. And we get the idea that things are not going to plan, and we need to make a response in that moment. We then move over to the recoil stage. So this is after that initial onset of the disaster, but before the disaster has ended. And basically, this can be of varying lengths. You can have short recoil stages. So if you had a fire in your house, maybe that impact is seeing the smoke under the door, and then you have the 20 minutes that it takes you to find your keys and get out of the front door. So the recoil stage, very short. In the pandemic, as we're seeing, it can go on for quite a sustained amount of time, and you can have varying lengths of that recoil stage. It then moves through to rescue, and rescue is quite an important stage. It's important for the people that are being rescued, that suddenly their ordeal is over. And it also needs to be considered from the point of view of the rescuers. So what impact does it have on emergency service workers to be involved in that incident and have to deal with, listening to the traumatic accounts that are being given by the people that they're rescuing? We move through again and we get to the last stage, which is that post-trauma. So this is after everything has sort of returned back to normal and people have to adapt back to normal life. So in the future, we're going to be looking at hopefully COVID recovery type incidents, and that will be very much at a societal level, that everybody will be moving through that recovery phase, that post-trauma phase. But in other instances, when individuals have gone through life-threatening disasters, then actually that's quite a personal journey to them, and they will move through the post-trauma session pretty much on their own as the world carries on normally around them. So we have those 5 stages. I just wanted to start by talking about preparedness. Now, I have a bit of a rep as being, the UK's leading prepper, or whatever strangeness that the media want to put on that label, but I do feel it's really important to communicate the benefits of preparedness and why it is that people should prepare for emergencies and not leave it just to central government or local government to organise. So going back to January 2020, I actually did an interview for the Metro newspaper where they did ask me what emergencies I was sort of most worried about. And I did actually at that stage say a pandemic, because that was the one thing that I thought in the UK context we were probably overdue, and we are quite privileged to not have as much exposure to things like hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes as other countries. So I thought that the pandemic was the most likely threat. So score 1 for me. I did like the headline almost a year later that said, "Woman who predicted pandemic now preparing for meteors and solar pulses." And I suppose that's true. As we move through, it's about thinking, what are the threats and how might we shape our behaviour now to help us later. And then that's really interesting because we see great individual difference in how people prep. And we also see great individual differences in why people don't. And I think the will writing is a really good example of this. And when you say to people, why haven't you written a will? Then they say, well, I don't want to think about that sort of thing. It's really psychologically uncomfortable. I don't want to, tempt fate. It's almost like, actually, if I write a will, it's going to make me more likely die. And of course it doesn't. We know objectively, if we look at that line of thinking, it's quite disordered. But actually, that is a real barrier to some people engaging in that sort of preparation behaviour. So I've done a number of studies looking at preparedness. The study on the screen now is related to some thinking that came out of looking at the Hurricane Katrina outcomes. And during Hurricane Katrina, there was a very sad story of a boy who was being evacuated to a hurricane shelter, and he wasn't able to take his pet with him. And there was some very distressing images of his little dog Snowy being pulled out of his arms as he was put on the bus to go to the evacuation centre. And the reason for that was the evacuation centre didn't have any pet facilities. And it got me thinking about whether I would leave, my pets if we were in a similar situation. So here are my cats, Bill and Ted, and they're awesome. But would I leave them if actually something happened in the local area that meant we had to evacuate quickly. And, you know, with every great study, that was the seed of the idea. And we did a questionnaire with one of my master's students, and we looked at pet ownership and to see whether pet ownership was actually a barrier to evacuation behaviours. It was a vignette study, so we postulated, you know, a hypothetical disaster scenario. In this case, it was a flood, and we asked whether they would evacuate if given the orders to by authorities. And what we found was that if somebody had a much higher attachment to their pet and they were unprepared, they were less likely to evacuate. So it seems quite minor, doesn't it, to get people to put a pet carrier to one side, maybe put together some food and medicine for their pet in case they need to go in some sort of pet go bag. But actually, this could be life-saving because it would mean that people had the confidence, should a disaster unfold, to evacuate in a timely manner. We've also been looking at preparedness in relation to COVID-19, and one of the studies that we've been looking at is whether preparing pre-COVID, so this is in the month just before lockdown, actually led to better outcomes for mental well-being in the May to June period last year. So we had over 400 participants take part in an online study, and we were just looking to see whether there were any demographics that impacted on preparedness, and then we were looking to see whether preparedness was linked to any positive outcomes later on. And what we did find was that those people who prepared didn't actually differ so much in terms of gender or socioeconomic status, which has been found previously. We assume that's because the preparations for COVID were quite straightforward and non-costly, so getting hand gel, making sure you had a mask, etc. But doing those things, you know, getting some extra food in, making sure you had enough toilet roll, all those things, if you did them pre-COVID, were then correlated with better mental health later. So lower levels of anxiety, depression, and subjective distress. Now, obviously, it's correlation, it's not causation, but it does show that preparedness does seem to have a relationship with mental well-being when a disaster is unfolding. That's possibly related to feelings of control. Another aspect that I'm really interested in with regard to preparedness is emergency training, and Mike Tebor really sums it up quite nicely when he says the precision of survival equipment is really of little use if people haven't been trained on how to use it. And that's very true. And I would actually go further as a psychologist and say it's not just using survival equipment that's important, it's about developing your own schema for emergencies, and also making sure that you have the right group work approach, making sure that you can show leadership if you need to. And so this led me to a collaboration with a colleague of mine, Michael Constantine, in our School of Justice policing unit. That's a bit of a mouthful, but that's where he is. And we were looking at our Hydra Minerva suite. So Hydra Minerva is a suite which allows a sort of role play of emergency decision making. So what you can see there is we have a briefing room where students come in, they're briefed on how to use the suite, then they are taken to little syndicate rooms. So we have 5 little rooms, and in groups of between about 3 and 8, depending on the cohort size, they will then have an emergency unfold in front of them. Now, we use this with our policing students, we also use it with our nursing students, and we can have a number of different scenarios, everything from a terror attack to a busy A&E unit. And what you see on the other screen there is the control unit, and that's where you send in the information into the syndicate rooms that then the students have to work on, and they come up with some decisions. Those decisions are logged, so they create a decision log on what we're actually really interested in is why they've come to certain decisions. We always say there are no right or wrong answers to responding to an emergency, but there have to be well justified responses, and that's what we're trying to get them to consider and develop. Also looking at them developing leadership skills, teamwork, communication. Pre-COVID, there's a lot of that. Pre-COVID, we started a research study. We had recruited 27 policing students. At this point, the study is ongoing, and as soon as we're back on campus, we'll be continuing with data collection. But I just wanted to give you an idea of the work that we've been doing here. One of the things that we identified quite early on to a barrier to engaging with training is anxiety. And we noticed that a lot of our students were quite anxious about coming into the Hydra Suite, and that was then meaning that they had that barrier to engagement. So we thought, well, is there some individual difference that's going on? You know, are they arriving in such a state that they're unable to engage? Let's just do a very basic study to have a look to see what might be a barrier to learning. And what we found was that actually personality trait neuroticism seemed to lead to higher anticipatory anxiety, as did students who were reporting low mood. So these were mild depressive symptoms. On the other hand, students with high levels of self-efficacy, those that were really open to experiences, they indicated really high arousal just prior to training, which seemed to suggest more engagement, and it seems that they were getting much more out of it. So one of the things that we're looking at doing is an intervention to try and make sure that prior to a training course, we don't see those high levels of anticipatory anxiety that can be a barrier to learning. So is it that we have to put students through this training in friendship groups? That possibly will contradict some of the learning outcomes, or is it that we need to bring them in for a trial go and then get them to come later for a fully immersed experience when they've got a bit of confidence? As I said, I enjoy the disaster and survival research, but I don't believe that research should be kept in dusty libraries and only looked at by academics. I'm very keen on public engagement, especially around the idea of prepping. I've done some very unusual things to try and get across the message that we should all be prepping at some level and what the practical things we can do to prep. So this has included some TV experiences. I've been involved in a piece of contemporary dance and verbatim theatre with the Tim Canson dance company, and we actually did a dance around prepping, and the picture you can see at the bottom is a graphical or visual portrayal of somebody giving up. So this is somebody going into a state of learnt helplessness that you can see portrayed there. So it was able to get across some of the literature surrounding prepping and also some of the reasons why people should prep, but in a more contemporary and I suppose innovative way. Obviously, because of COVID, we haven't been able to take that production on tour like we hoped. And so we've actually tried instead to develop an Alexa app. So this is more gamification, looking at using the Alexa device to take people through an immersive experience where they're in a survival setting, and during that immersive experience we explain some of the psychology around prepping. Okay, so that's going to bring me on to the actual impact and recoil stages. So this is the point where the emergency is ongoing. I think here we can look back and sort of see that some people actually cope very effectively. I think we call them the cool, calm and collected individuals. So we've got that top percent of the top 10 to 25% of the population, according to Leach, that can handle being an emergency. They do very well. Then we have what I would call the stunned rabbits, you know, rabbits in headlights. The 65 to 80% of people, they're sort of getting on with things. They can more or less get themselves together, but actually they can't maybe initiate behaviours as well, or do some of the more complicated decision making. And then we have that bottom 10 to 15% that sort of lose it. I call these the headless chickens. And at this point, the person hasn't really got the mental function to do anything productive to get them through the emergency, and they're very much reliant on other people to get them through. So what is it about that impact situation that is so challenging? Well, two main things. It's very time pressured. You're having to make rapid judgments, and it's also new and novel. So these stimuli are things that you haven't come across before, potentially. So you're having to make decisions very rapidly. And I was really interested in that very initial moment when the incident starts, and to try and find out what it was that made some people victims and some people survivors. So why is it some people can go on and do really well, take that bold leadership role and help them and then their fellow survivors make it out of there, whereas other people seem to disintegrate and not cope as effectively. And I was really interested right at the start of my PhD, so this is my first paper that I ever had published, at looking at that interplay between the biological changes and the cognitive performance. And one of the things that the paper threw up was that actually when we get a release of the what the media called the stress hormone, but cortisol, when we get a release of circulating cortisol, which you can see as the red peak here on this graph, this is just after people have been through the underwater helicopter escape training, we see impairments in working memory. So prior to Hewitt, people are functioning at a normal level regarding their working memory, but immediately after it becomes impaired. And looking at laboratory studies and taking those in combination with my research, it suggested that actually potentially cortisol, although it has a great impact on the body, you know, it's a glucocorticoid, it gets that glucose going to your muscles so that you're ready for your maintained response to the threat. Actually, it may have a negative impact on cognitive functioning. And what I've tried to do since is really look at how we can keep the brain working well during that impact phase and the early recoil stages. And also, if we can identify which bits of the brain are falling apart, you know, which bits don't work so well, maybe we can change the design of survival training and survival equipment to basically improve survival chances. The other thing that I always get asked is, can we screen? Can we screen and pick out those people who are going to work really well in a disaster and those people who can't? And if only it was so simple, I would have probably made a whole load of money by now. But it's proving very difficult to pinpoint particular traits that mean that somebody is more likely to behave in that cool, calm and collected manner compared to somebody who's going to fall apart. So, for example, we thought maybe people who had higher levels of neuroticism prior to COVID, prior to Hewitt, would show a more marked impairment in their cognitive performance. And this didn't turn out to be true. We did see that, people's cognitive ability, this case in the letter cancellation test, was preserved prior to Hewitt and then impaired as people went through the sort of recovery from Hewitt, but that did not change as a result of the level of neuroticism, which did seem to indicate that those personality traits were not something that would be useful to screen for. So I looked a little bit wider, and we were looking at maybe some of the other things that can differentiate a survivor from a victim. If you look at the work of Martin Seligman, he suggests that optimism can be very beneficial in everyday life and in challenging situations. So I thought, oh, let's have a look at optimism. So with one of my master's students, we went to our local fire training ground, and we were looking at people going through an emergency search and rescue task. And what we found was that those participants who had that high dispositional optimism had lower perceived stress after firefighting. So there did seem to be some protection from being just generally optimistic. We also found that those participants who were low in situational optimism, so optimistic that they could, who weren't very optimistic that they could actually do the training, showed a significant fall in arousal post-stressor. So if you didn't think you were going to do very well, and you were quite negative about your chances of completing the training, you did seem to be much more aroused by the training and much more engaged. The other thing that I've been interested in is looking at whether we can put some nutritional interventions in place which could help people to keep their cognitive functioning intact during an emergency. So if we think about the emergency services, they could be on a call for a number of hours, and during that time their cognitive performance might be negatively impacted. Is there any nutritional intervention that we could give them? We were interested in sports drinks for this study, and we were looking at different formulations of sports drinks. So we were looking at a high caffeine, high glucose, and a caffeine only and a glucose only drink. And what we found was that the ideal combination was a low level of caffeine, but with a high level of glucose. And that seemed to aid cognitive functioning the best in people going through firefighter training. I've since done some studies looking at chewing gum. And I don't have time to go into the details, but basically, when we went back to the fire service and said that they would have to supply, lots of drinks to people to help them out cognitively, they did sort of say that it wasn't terribly practical to have lots of sticky drinks floating around fire engines. So we were looking for a more sort of, less messy, I think is the only way we could say it, nutritional intervention. And chewing gum has a lot of benefits in that it's small, compact, easy to transport, and you can add things like caffeine to it. So we do have another study which we're in the process of writing up, which has looked at caffeinated gum, a chewing gum with an amino acid called L-theanine in it, and a normal gum, and we're just analysing those results at the moment. Okay, so I think, Peter, we said we'd have a pause halfway through for questions, and we've just hit 5:30, so now might be a good time.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarita. So we've got one question here from Lazaros Philippidis, who says, you mentioned that 10 to 15% of the population in a crisis don't behave efficiently and are disoriented. You used the term headless chicken. Do you imply that this large number of people panic in a crisis situations, or does this percentage include people that behave irrationally to the external observer, but actually act based on the information they're aware of during the incident.
Yeah.
Research actions show that the number of people actually panicking is very small.
Yeah. So the it's a great question, and I think, yeah, I'd come back with the idea that it isn't necessarily panic that we're seeing. There may be a number of different behaviours that sort of fall into that group. I wouldn't say they're appropriate actions. It's more that people may not be able to generate an action. So we see people who go into freeze. So, you get fight and flight. We also see freezing behaviours, what John Leach calls cognitive paralysis, where you can't generate a new behaviour in time and you seem to become stuck. We also see irrational behaviours happening, which are basically when people say, well, I can't generate an action. What I'm going to do is dig back into my schema and look for something that's a bit similar, a similar action, and I'm going to initiate that action instead. So when we look at people, for example, in the Twin Towers disaster, what we saw was people not really knowing how to evacuate a building when planes were crashing into it, because that was new and novel. So what they did was they went through their normal going home behaviour. So they started to do things like switching off their computers, putting the milk in the fridge, putting their coats. So they didn't do what we would consider to be rational, but they did instigate a behaviour that they were hoping would at some point hopefully lead them to a successful egress from the building.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the only question for now. I say, so for the audience, do please keep typing your questions into the Q&A, and we'll come back to some further questions at the end. Thank you, Sarita.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter. So moving on, we've talked now about the pre-impact stage, so those preparedness behaviours, and how differences in human sort of psychology can influence how people respond prior to a disaster taking place, and the effect that those prior decisions can have on things like evacuation behaviours. We've talked about the impact stage, so those are the sort of physiological changes that happen and the psychological parameters such as time limitations and new and novel stimuli that then lead to some people not being able to make appropriate responses. Now, I just wanted to talk a little bit about recoil. So this is when a disaster goes on for a little bit of time. So this is before people get to rescue. And I was quite interested in how people responded in a simulated firefighter emergency. So this was a 90-minute firefighting scenario, and we were very lucky to be able to get access to non-firefighters. So this population had come to the fire training ground to undergo a 5-day training course where they would be taught how to put out fires, because they were going to go and work on a ferry. And basically, they came from all walks of life. So we had opera singers that were going to go and work on ferries. We had shop workers that were going to go and work on ferries. So these were non-specialist people that were being asked to do firefighting. So it was quite a unique population. And for the 3 days that they focused on the fire scenario, it was broken down into the first day, which was basically just equipment demonstration. So they were walked through how to use the BA system. They talked through how to use the hoses, and they walked through the basic theory of how to put out a fire. The second day was more practical and quite physically demanding, because they put on the BA kit, they physically walked around the fire ground, they physically got out the hoses and had a look at, how the equipment worked. And then on the third day, we had the physical stress. So they were still in the BA kit, they were still doing the physical sort of walk around the fireground, but they also had a psychological component, because on day 3 we added the heat and the smoke. So it was very, very warm in the fire scenario. We had flashovers, so it was quite intense at that point. And what we did was that we took saliva samples to look for cortisol over the 3 days, and we looked at a battery of cognitive tasks that were related to things that might be useful, or cognitive processes that would be useful during firefighting. What was quite interesting was that it wasn't until day 3 that we saw this increase in cortisol. So you needed the presence of both the physical and the psychological pressure in order to increase cortisol in the circulating saliva, in the circulating systems, and then we could process from the saliva. With regard to cognitive impairments, things like working memory were impaired, the visual search task was impaired, but visual declarative memory was actually preserved. And this was, one of the first studies that we've seen where we can show that it isn't just that we get a uniform failure of the brain in these high stress situations. Actually, certain bits are preserved and other bits become impaired. And I suppose all this research has led to some outcomes that, or some learning that I'd like to share. And basically, you can improve survival with training. And the reason that you can improve survival with training is because it reduces working memory load. All of the studies I've shown you, either with the underwater helicopter escape or with the firefighting, show this impairment in working memory. So that's the online CPU of the brain. It's where you make all your decisions sort of in real time. And that's the bit that becomes impaired. So if you go through some of the training, so how to use the equipment, how to work as a team, how to show leadership, rehearse some of the decisions that you might have to make in an emergency, you're actually taking the pressure away from your working memory. So basically, by becoming familiar with safety procedures, it can really help. So I give this example. I say the first time that you'll pick up a fire extinguisher to use it shouldn't be during a fire, because you may not know how to use it, and that is not the time that you want to be stood there with a blazing fire reading the instructions on the side of the extinguisher. So a lot of training. I think the military call it skills and drills. We just drill it over and over and over again. And that's because we know that things like procedural memory seem to be preserved. So if we can move that workload from working memory to procedural memory during an emergency, we should be able to manage better. The other thing about training is that it improves your confidence and it improves your optimism. And this is very useful, because if you're more confident and you're more optimistic about your ability to survive, then actually your anxiety is reduced and you might not then secrete as much cortisol, which then might have that negative effect on working memory. I have produced with John Leach a book chapter which went into the International Handbook of Psychobiology, which is the most up-to-date review of how biological processes sort of change when we're under pressure. So if you are interested, then this would be a good book chapter to read. So that takes us through to the next stage, which is rescue. And as I said, rescue is a really interesting stage, both from the point of view of the people being rescued, but also the emergency services. And if the emergency services know how a potential victim will respond, then that can be very informative and help them to provide better care. So here is an example. So during the rescue stage, one of the things that I've observed is that we can see cognitive collapse. So what does that mean? It means that people seem to be absolutely okay for the first, however many days, in this case 5 days of an emergency, but at the point that they're rescued, they start to fall away cognitively, and they start to not become responsive and start to not know where they are. So in this case, one of the police officers who responds to a woman, Kirsty Hopkins, who's been trapped in her car after it came off a highway in America. It slid down a bank and she was there for 5 days. And what the police officer says is that Miss Hopkins was responsive at first, even telling her rescuers she was not hurt. She started to become less responsive as we carried her down the hill. And this is something that we see time and time again, that people seem to be able to hold it together during the emergency, but once they feel that they are safe, they start to disintegrate cognitively. Now, obviously, this has huge implications if you are a rescuer, because you might come up with someone, a victim, and they seem very compos mentis, and they are, responding to your questioning. You might then get them in a helicopter to evacuate them, at which point they become disorientated and then become a threat to the crew because they don't quite know what they are and are not behaving appropriately. I have experienced this cognitive collapse myself. So about, probably going back about 5 or 6 years ago, I was invited to take part in the Coastal Survival training down at RAF St Morgan. As you can see from the first picture there, I'm really happy. That's day 3, which is the lowest day. It was April, it was snowing, it was cold. I think I possibly had mild hypothermia by this point, and I was fairly grumpy, but I was very determined, because I hadn't had any civilians or women on the course before, that I was not going to bottle it and go back to the nice officers' mess where they had a room waiting for me, and that I was going to rough it out for the whole 5 days. And in the other picture there, you can see is me having made it. At this point, I am now officially rescued. I've passed the training course, and I just sat there and wouldn't do anything until they brought me a cup of tea, because my brain had just decided at that point to switch itself off. They were lovely. They did bring me a cup of tea. So we tried to replicate this again, looking at people going through firefighter training, and we were looking at sustained attention, because we were trying to work out when it was that people start to show this cognitive decline. So people went through the 90-minute search and rescue, and then we got them to continue with an oddball task. So this was a auditory distraction task where they had to pay attention and then make correct responses. And what we found was that in the firefighting group, our participants showed an improvement to start with, but then at around the 15-minute point, that performance started to drop away. And we didn't see that in our control sample. So how are we doing for time? Oh goodness, we're on time, so that's great. So this is just the last section, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that I've been mainly concentrating on for the sort of last 4 or 5 years, which has been looking at post-traumatic growth. Now, after a traumatic event, we know that there are individual differences in people's response. So it isn't that everybody that's experiencing a disaster then goes on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. It seems to be that about 5 to 10% of people go on to have that impaired functioning. Most people return to normal functioning, although there can be slight non-clinical differences in how successful that recovery is. And then we actually have a group at the other extreme, another sort of 5 to 10%, who report that although, yes, the trauma has been horrendous, yes, there have been negative things that have happened, they've also experienced post-traumatic growth. And they can identify positive outcomes as a result of being through that traumatic incident. So just to give you another little visual description, you can see here that we have the adverse event happening, and we have people who succumb, we have people who survive but with impairment. Then we have that resilience, which is just, you know, getting back to how you were pre-incident. And then this PTG is actually an enhancement on that. Yeah, it's building back better. Somehow they've grown as a result of the traumatic incident. So what we've been really interested in is having a look to see why it is that some people do show this growth, whereas others don't. And we wanted to see whether that growth was still there in people who experience multiple traumas, because quite a lot of the literature only looks at people who are exposed to single instances or single traumatic events, and then look at the consequence after that. And as we all know from, you know, our own lives and those of our people around us, that is rarely the case, isn't it? It's usually that throughout our lives we're exposed to a number of different traumatic events, multiple traumatic events. We very rarely just seem to be exposed to one thing. So this body of work actually culminated in our cognitive growth and stress model, where we tried to look at what those individual differences were that predicted growth more than predicting sort of no growth or potentially PTSD. We found that rumination was really important, so whether that was intrusive or deliberate. We found that centrality was important, so how much the event became part of your identity, and also the perceived level of control over the stressful event. And that can be the stressful event, you know, whether it was controllable at the time it was happening, is now, or how you feel that that's going to go in the future. So the cognitive growth and stress model really is our first step to understanding why it is some people grow and some people end up with trauma. As I noted before, we were quite interested as well as this idea of multiple trauma and whether that is linked to PTG. And it was quite interesting when we did the qualitative interviews that some of the links between things like, say, spiritualism and PTG that we'd seen before on these single traumatic incident studies, we saw the same links, but perhaps the relationship wasn't as we expected. So, for example, in our study, we saw a link between spiritualism and growth. But actually, that spiritualism wasn't necessarily that people regained their religious belief. We had some survivors who reported that they actually lost their religious belief, and that was the thing that was most useful to them, because they stopped thinking that it was God's will and they just got on with their lives. We've been going forward trying to look at the different factors that can predict growth and seeing whether they might differ in different scenarios or different disasters. Pre-COVID, we were doing a study looking at place attachment in response primarily to flooding. And what we wanted to see whether people's attachment to their home actually could lead to more distress and less resilience than people who might not have had that same place attachment when a disaster like a flood arrived. I think we'd managed to get about 30 responses to this questionnaire just before COVID caused us to suspend our data collection, but all was not lost, because we thought, actually, with COVID, what we have is a really interesting a scenario where people are being made to stay at home. So these aren't people that are being evacuated, forced to leave their home. It's actually the opposite. We've got people who are being told to stay at home. It could save lives. And so what we've been doing, again, we're just at the point of doing the data analysis here, is we've been examining mental health during the COVID pandemic in relation to sense of place. Looking at the early sort of analysis, it does look like sense of place doesn't really have any predictive, doesn't really predict mental health outcomes. Things like age, subjective health status, and social support did seem to predict, negative sort of outcomes in terms of anxiety, depression, and subjective distress, but that didn't seem to be related to how attached you were to your home. So we were quite surprised by that, and I think it probably needs a little bit more investigation. We did see from some of the qualitative responses, we've got evidence of growth even during COVID, and just one of the participants, for example, talked about this gift of isolation and how useful it had been to have this pause in their lives and a period for reflection. So really, I suppose all I can conclude is that behaviour during life-threatening emergencies is really complicated. Yeah, we don't quite understand which parts of the brain are falling over. We don't really understand how that all fits together in some sort of jigsaw, with a biological layer that affects survival, a psychological layer that affects survival, and that's all within a context of those sociological or social level factors. I suppose moving forward, what I'm really keen to do now is focus on those biological underpinnings of trauma response and recovery. And I think there is some work to do now to sort of open out our work on post-traumatic growth to look at those biological or potential biological underpinnings. I'm also interested in work that looks at barriers to preparedness, because it really always surprises me that people don't prepare for emergencies. And I hope that maybe that's one of the things that we are going to take away with us post-COVID, that people, especially in the UK, will see that life can change quite dramatically in quite a short amount of time, and preparing for those types of emergency could be quite useful. And finally, I think there is always going to be a lot of COVID recovery work moving forward to try and help people potentially grow as a result of this collective trauma that we've been going through now for far too long. So key reading, if you're interested and you want to learn more, then I think that the Fighting for Your Lives chapter is a really good place to start. And the other sort of more general introduction to my work is that How Can Psychology Inform Disaster Research paper that just gives a nice overview of how psychology can inform disaster work. There are, oops, gosh, I've clicked the wrong button there for definite. It was all going so well. So I'm going to stop sharing, but I should really probably just end with, if you do want to get in contact, there's my email address. You can follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and there's also the website for further information. I'll stop sharing now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Sarita. A really interesting and fascinating talk. We've got a couple of minutes for some questions, which I'm just going to read from the chat. I haven't got too long, but Colin Payne asks, prepping has quite an individualistic narrative, at least in popular culture. How do we promote better engagement with resilient preparedness at a more community or society level?
Yeah, that's a lovely question, actually, because you really hit a key point, that survivalism, prepping can have quite a macho, male toxic masculinity type of overtone to it, that it's all, I don't know, Mad Max, and you know, everyone's going to be out for themselves. And I think that even in March, when everybody was running around looking for toilet roll, people were not being very considerate of other people. So more community level preparations would be much more desirable. How do we do that? I think that's an interesting question. I think teaching preparedness from a younger age is quite useful, and also having a better narrative around how preparedness is not just for men with huge muscles can also be very beneficial. I literally say that the best preppers that I know are parents of young children, because they will literally go out with their go bag, which has everything in it for them and their child, and they don't even know they've got a go bag. They certainly wouldn't call it that, but that's what it is.
Thank you. Another question here about the psychology of crowds from James Shepherd Barron, saying, giving the example of California in the 2011 tsunami, with the governor then, Arnie Schwarzenegger, saying that half the people just went down to the beach to watch. So could you say something about the psychology of crowds?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you go back to the War of the Worlds radio play that I think what came out in the 1930s in America, that one of the things that was really fascinating was that people decided that this radio show was real, and they all sort of took various behaviors. And one of the things that wasn't expected at that point was that a big load of people turned up with pitchforks to take on the aliens, because they wanted to go and see what was happening. So you can never really predict what people are going to do, I think, is the take-home message there. And I think some of that is down to the fact that people don't believe that things can happen, and they want to see it with their own eyes. Other things are that it's just a bit of excitement and you don't really understand the full implications of what could go wrong. Yeah, I'd really like to know why it is that, for example, during COVID, some people are not complying with the emergency, guidelines that we've been given, whereas other people do. Good question. Not sure I have the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. It's 6 o'clock now. There are a few other unanswered questions, and maybe those people can maybe just email them into you if that is all right. So again, I thank you really very much for a really fascinating talk. Thank you for joining us today.
Delighted.